Well, it looks like we just got a major twist. So not even a couple of days ago, we made a video talking about the classic Sonic timeline. In particular, there was a lot of big adjustments and just some clarifications that were made about specifically where Sonic Superstars fits into the classic Sonic timeline. And to catch all of you up to speed, you could go watch the full video prior to this just to get the real, true, full context. I don't want to do it all over again when I just did it 4 days ago. There's a lot more to the story, but essentially, we got official word from Sonic Team as to when Sonic Superstars takes place in the Sonic timeline, which was after Mania but before Sonic Adventure. And while this all may seem obvious, it actually isn't, and the information that we're going to get into, brand new developments about the classic Sonic timeline, are going to explain why a lot of people had confusion with this. So we're going to get into these brand new developments about the classic Sonic timeline, but before we do that, please subscribe to the channel with all notifications for daily Sonic content. I'll give you a second to do that. Please like the video, join the discussion down below. I'd really like to hear what you guys have to say about this, especially if you saw the video I posted the other day. With that being said, let's get into it. So here's an excerpt from the video that I did the other day, but this is going to catch a lot of you up to speed really fast. But if you look right here, a lot of people basically essentially thought this is what the Sonic timeline was. So we had every Sonic game before Generations happens, and then there's a timeline split. So we have Sonic Lost World, and then it goes into Sonic Mania, and then the timeline converges again for Sonic Forces, which obviously deals with time travel and stuff like that. Sonic Mania Plus happens, and then Sonic continues the rest of the timeline. At one point in time, the conventional thinking for the franchise was this. Because of the elements of time travel and meeting yourself in the past, it was reasonable to assume that this timeline split occurred. If classic Sonic meets himself in the past timeline, clearly he would know things from the future that would alter his past, thus creating a timeline split. But a couple of years later, this line of thinking was actually debunked, or at least they decided to do a retcon and take an official stance on this.
I like to call him Classic Sonic. That's how Sonic looked in the past. This one here, that's the Sonic he grew up to be.
Dr. Eggman and his younger self used an ancient being called the Time Eater to mess with all of space-time. The Sonic of the past and the Sonic of the now had to team up to defeat the Eggman. Usual, Sonic and Sonic saved the day. We said our goodbyes, and Classic Sonic safely traveled back through the dimensional portal to his own time.
And at one point when the lore was in flux, there was definitely some thinking that Classic was classic and Modern was modern. Let's roll the clip.
Just consider Classic one thing right now. So, Classic stories happen in the Classic universe, and don't worry too much about the Classic timeline.
All right. Worry not about the timeline. You're telling people to not worry about the timeline, Ian. I don't think that's...
I'm worried about it. So you can see why some fans were confused and why some people went with this theory that there's like 2 different timeline splits. But the official stated position by Sega is now this. There is no timeline split. Classic Sonic is just a younger version of Modern Sonic, and all of the events line up to one singular timeline. This was cleared up in a Tales Tube episode, which is pretty crazy for these type of lore dumps. So what is the reason for this discussion today? Why are we back here talking about this again just 4 days later after we recently talked about it? Well, here is the groundbreaking information. So at one point in time, the idea that Classic Sonic actually separated into a separate timeline, which is what we kind of talked about earlier today, was actually something that Sega may have believed as well. Now, this has been retconned clearly with some of the stuff we talked about earlier. So is this really important to talk about? I don't know. If you like talking about Sonic lore like we do here, yes, it's important. But listen, this is what Sega and Ian Flynn had to say about the proposed Neo Classic Sonic timeline. Let's roll the clip.
Why and how? If Eggman didn't know about the Phantom Ruby as seen in the Sonic Forces prequel comic, and Sonic and Tails don't remember going through Sonic Generations as their...
This question is pretty crazy because I feel like he's basically... I don't know if this guy watched my video or something like that, but it's pretty crazy.
Why and how? Then why...
Like, this is the discussion we were just having, but let's roll the clip. This is pretty important.
How do they remember Sonic Mania, but not that? Did the Phantom Ruby fuse the timelines after the events of Sonic Forces?
This ties back into your earlier question about what is canon, and it's whatever the licensor wants at the time.
He's spitting, though. Yo, Ian Flynn, listen. He's spitting.
So as of Sonic Forces, there was an idea of 2 timelines, of Classic being its own thing.
This is crazy. Like, this is actually crazy that he's really saying this, because this is the theory that a lot of people had.
But then it was decided that they are all one timeline.
Mm-hmm.
So there's only so many cracks the plot spackle's going to cover. So if you want to say that the Phantom Ruby caused some timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly mental degradation, sure, that works.
Oh, okay, so it's kind of like retconning.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, it's a lot of that.
some of the retcons will be gentle. Some of them will be applied with a sledgehammer.
That's what it is.
There's only so much that can be done with a 30-year franchise.
That's it. So again, it's important to remember that Sega is hiring a lore manager to ensure the universe is more meaningfully connected going forward. So again, we're going to have to deal with some retcons and stuff like that to try their best to tie this timeline, but we're going to really have to judge this more harshly going forward. What's crazy about this is that the Neo Classic Sonic timeline theory at one point was actually technically considered canon, or at least that's something that like was in line with the thinking of Sega, which is pretty which is just like crazy to think about. Now we can get into like why this is inconsistent and stuff like that, but I'll leave that video linked in the end screen if you want to get into all that. But at one point in time, there was an idea that the classic timeline could have been separate. And personally, I don't actually prefer this. I think it's better to just keep all the canon media just in one timeline and just try your best to make it work. Reason being is I don't like the idea of multiverses and stuff like that. I want everything that happens in the games to matter and things of that nature. Although there are some people on the other side that would argue maybe it could be limiting in the type of stories that classic Sonic can tell, because you're only limited to what happens before Sonic Adventure. But with that being said, this crazy theory that people had for many years actually had a lot of merit to it. And that's why it's important to have these discussions, because it's fun. We get to flesh out the lore. It's what I love to do. So the question is, would you have preferred them to do the alternate Neo Classic Sonic timeline? Or do you like that it's all tied together in just one simple timeline? We're not splitting off too much, no multiverse stuff. But for those of you worried about the inconsistencies about the Classic Sonic timeline, I would like to point you to the previous video that I did a couple days ago for that discussion. But here's the last clip that I'll play that provides some context as to some of this decision making as well as some of the inconsistencies.
If Mania is part of the single timeline, how come none of the modern cast remember it or the Phantom Ruby? Same goes for Generations, really.
Because it wasn't thought of at the time.
At some point in their history, they all got Men in Black flashed. Every single character. Can't remember a dang thing before Sonic Adventure 1.
It's one of those things where if we were to go back and try to rationalize and explain every little inconsistency, it would do more damage than it would fix things, I think, in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not 100% satisfying, sure, but at this point, 30 years into the brand, and now there is an actual dedicated focus to having a cohesive lore that looks both backwards and forwards in the long term, there's no way to reconcile everything. So it is what it is.
You're going to be basically like constantly chasing retcons if you do that, because inevitably you'll get to a point where there were so many retcons that you will have to then retcon the retcons, and just like, well, here we are. It's constant cycle.
At that rate, I'd say it'd just be easier to start over and do a new modern Sonic, but
they tried that. It didn't work out very well.
Boom was its own thing.
No. I mean, Sonic 06. They tried to reboot.
And then that got folded into the greater narrative, and here we are.
Yeah, I was going to say, that was more of a...
Which one do you guys prefer? If you want the full scope of the discussion, please watch the video on the end screen to get the full context. But let me know down below in the comments what you guys think.